podcast. I am Dr. Darren Wolfe. I am a board certified forensic pathologist slash medical examiner, and I love to talk about forensics. And so that's why I'm here, and you're here to presumably learn something about forensics. Now, this is the second episode of the first season, and what I'm going to talk about today was originally intended to be the first episode, the initial episode, to kind of give you an idea of where I'm going with this. Now, of course, we didn't do that for the first episode because of this very important case that occurred where we reviewed the autopsy report of George Floyd, because there were a lot of misconceptions and a lot of misunderstandings about that autopsy report. So, with that having been done in the first episode, we can now come back to what was originally intended to open the season. Now, today's episode is called Of Corpses and Cadavers, and this is actually the first part because I'm not going to be able to do all I want to do in one podcast episode. It would be too rushed and too crammed. So today, even though it's Of Corpses and Cadavers, we're actually going to talk about cadavers first, and then corpses will be talked about in the next one. And so I know you're thinking, corpses and cadavers, this is a synonym, right? What is the difference? Is there a difference? And well, there are differences. It's a little bit of semantics. For one, cadaver is generally the term used for a body used for anatomical dissection for learning. Medical students and students in anthropology and other fields, anatomy graduate students and things like that. The cadaver is very different in its substance from the corpse. Now, a cadaver is a corpse, but I don't feel like a corpse is a cadaver, because a corpse in my field is what I call the freshly dead, or someone who hasn't been embalmed or sort of pickled in formalin or formaldehyde like a cadaver is. So I wanted to talk about these things because the cadaver itself has a very different substance, a very different feel than the corpse. And my first experience with death would have been with the gross anatomy cadaver. I'll get to that a little bit more in a moment. But what I want to do is I want you to get an idea for what I call the substance of death, okay? So we always hear people say, oh, we're just meat and bones, right? There's just nothing other than just our physical elements. And that is in some sense true. However, we are infused with nutrient rich, warm blood pumping through our bodies. We are also animated by electrical energy through our nervous system. And this provides sensation and allows us to move. So, um, you know, I'm basically talking about the not just the machinations of how we move and how we think, but the physical substance of the body. And so without the animation, then we're left with, what's left behind, the body itself, the corpse, the cadaver. I call it the great machine. But the moment we die, the clock begins to tick. And after that last electrical impulse is sent by the brain, the process of decay starts. The heart stops and the process of decay starts. And so there's a short window of time there when there's really not much visually different between the living and the dead. If you were to look at a body that's freshly dead, you can't say that body is clearly dead, other than it's, of course, not breathing. And so in that short time, the body is either autopsied or sent to a funeral home, usually for burial preparation, which may be cremation, or it may be embalming and burial, which is very typical, of course, in the Western world. And so this window of time before the body is sent for its final preparation is what I'm talking about. So I really like to differentiate between the corpse and the cadaver because it gives you the two elements or the two manifestations of what we see as doctors of the dead. And so, starting with the cadaver, I mean, I guess the first thing I think is, when was the first time you ever saw a dead body? Like, have you ever thought of that before? When was the first time you saw a dead body? I mean, for most of us who aren't serial killers or happen upon a random body like in the movie Stand by Me, our first experience is typically at a funeral, right? That's when most people see their first dead body and their first experience with death. But for me, that actually was not the case. I think that I had probably an unusual experience in that my whole life, up until my first day of medical school, I actually had never seen a dead body. I'd never been around a dead body, which, that was about 25 years before I started medical school and did not have any experience with that. So my first, dead body experience was the cadaver in the first day of medical school. And so this was unusual because, right, you're 25 years old, and usually somebody dies, a family member or friend, and you go to the funeral. But I I guess you could say I was lucky. I did not have any close family members or friends die in that time frame. I did have some family members die when I was very young child, and either I don't remember being at the funeral or I didn't go for whatever reason. But as you can imagine, when you are 25 years old and have never seen a dead body, there's a little bit of anxiety that's associated with going to medical school and knowing that you're going to be dissecting a cadaver on the first day, and that you might be the only person in the room who hasn't seen a dead body. And so naturally, you have to wonder how you're going to react to that. So at the moment I gained acceptance to medical school, I opened my letter and it said that I was in. I started thinking about that very shortly thereafter. Is I'm going to be dissecting a corpse, and I need to. I guess I should say cadaver, right? Because I made the distinction, but um, I knew that I was going to be presented with this challenge, this rite of passage in medical school. And so one of the things I did to kind of hope I could, break the ice or diminish the anxiety in this situation was to see an autopsy. I wanted to reach out to my local hospital and pathologists and get signed up to come and see an autopsy. So I gave them a call and they agreed. They said, "Oh, yes, this is a great idea. You're going to be a medical student. You definitely want to see an autopsy." And so I put my name in, and then, weeks went by, and I was very excited and nervous to go. And then weeks became months. And finally, August, which is when we start medical school, arrived, and I never got to see an autopsy. So I called the hospital and I said, "Well, I really, really would like to see an autopsy. I just feel like I need to do this before I go dissect this cadaver in medical school." And they, in fact, had no autopsies in that time. And this is a very surprising element for people, is that hospitals really aren't doing many autopsies nowadays. And of course, consider this was 20 years ago when I was going into medical school. But it's been like that for a while. And the truth is, hospitals don't regularly autopsy patients much anymore. In 1972, the government, which used to use autopsy performance as a quality control measure, they actually eliminated that requirement in 1972. So at that point, when hospitals didn't need to do them, of course, they stopped doing them because They take up a lot of time. And in fact, it declined every year after that until the early 1990s, early to mid 1990s. It got down to about 5% of the people who died in a hospital got an autopsy. So, in other words, out of every 100 hospital deaths, only five would get autopsied. And this always surprises people. People who aren't in medicine think that autopsies are occurring a lot. And in fact, they aren't. I must distinguish hospital autopsies are not common. Forensic autopsies are quite common because any unnatural death is investigated, or I shouldn't say not just unnatural, but any kind of surprise death, unexpected death, is investigated by forensic autopsy, which is not affiliated with the hospital, although sometimes they do occur in hospitals. So all those months went by, they didn't have one autopsy, and I wasn't able to experience that before my gross anatomy class. Of course, now the other reason why pathologists in the hospitals weren't doing autopsies is they don't get paid for them anymore. I mean, maybe 50 years ago they did, but after that requirement was removed, there were no more hospital autopsies, no more pathologists getting paid. And for those of you who have done autopsies, they're very laborious procedures. They might take hours to complete if you're really thorough. And then you have hours and hours of medical records to review. And then you have tests such as microbiology or toxicology, looking at the tissues under the microscope. So you're putting in 10, 12 hours on every case and actually not getting paid anything. So hospital pathologists are sort of notorious for not wanting to do autopsies. And that's always a surprise to people. And they usually, hospital pathologists now, they just like to send them to the forensic, which would be me. And I was a hospital pathologist at one point, and I did a handful of autopsies in my hospital career. But of course, now I do a lot of autopsies. Of course, it wasn't always like that. In the first half of the 20th century, and before that, about half of all people dying in the hospital got an autopsy. So, around 50%. And earlier than that, you go back through the 1940s and the 1930s, the numbers were even higher, 70, 80%. Medical students were required to perform autopsies, and all doctors would attend their autopsies. I remember talking to a dermatologist once, and he said that he had performed autopsies in medical school, and that his father, who was also a doctor and a dermatologist, had performed autopsies. So that's kind of wild to think about a dermatologist doing an autopsy. No respect to dermatologists, but it's just a kind of an unusual thought, because now it is solely the realm of the pathologist, and really just the forensic pathologist at this point. Although hospital autopsies are performed more at med centers than at community hospitals. And so because now I said prior to this, I wasn't going to do a lot of history. That's what I said in the first episode. But in this part where we're talking about cadavers, we're going to do a little bit of history. And so, as I said earlier, in medical education, there was a lot of interest in having medical students perform, autopsies or cadaver dissections and things like that. And so these bodies were actually a very high commodity. They were a very valuable commodity for medical schools back through the early 1900s and through the 1800s and even the early 1800s. The bodies were hard to come by. And so this is the historical portion that I'm going to tell you about. And I know many people listening to this will know this story, but not everybody has a background in medicine or pathology or history, medical history. But this is the really brief story of two guys named Burke and Hare. Okay. These guys were in Scotland, in Edinburgh. And this is a story that's been told many times. It's been written about in books, lots of book chapters. And so we're going to go back to 1828 in Edinburgh, Scotland. There was a guy named William Burke and William Hare. Well, at the time, there was a shortage of legally obtainable cadavers. Okay. Scottish law at the time said that you could only dissect at a medical school, you could only dissect people who had died in prison, who had died by suicide, and orphans. So, if you think about that, you're not going to have someone dying every day in a prison. Maybe you might have somebody dying by suicide every day, but then you have to hope that they're found before they decompose. And because a decomposed body is not that useful for dissection for medical school, because the anatomy, of course, as it decays, it becomes unreal compared to what you need to know as a physician, as a surgeon. And then orphans, of course, was the third category. So because there weren't enough cadavers, they were worth a lot. And you have to consider that embalming hadn't really been invented yet. Sometimes they would submerge the body in alcohol, like whiskey, to keep it preserved. But of course, that's a lot of whiskey, depending on the size of the person, of course. But in the 1820s, you didn't have embalming, and so someone dies, and then the clock starts ticking, and the decomposition clock. And a body that's liquefying is, again, not useful for dissection. So fresh bodies were a very premium thing. Well, that's where Burke and Hare came in. Now, these guys were they had a guy die basically in their presence, like in one of their apartments, and so they didn't quite know what to do with the body, so they took it to the medical school, and they ended up getting a lot of money for it. And then I guess the light bulb went off, and these guys said, "Well, why would we go dig up bodies?" Because at the time, grave robbing was a thing. People would go into the cemetery, they would dig up bodies, and they would steal jewelry off of them, or sometimes they would try to send them for anatomical dissection. So much so that families would sometimes put a big concrete slab on top of the grave for a certain period of time to kind of ensure that the body would be decomposing and therefore not be worth anything to a dissector. And then they would remove the slab, or sometimes they would have watchmen, like in a watchtower in the cemetery, to make sure people weren't stealing bodies. So Burke and Hare decided to just cut out the middleman and say, well, instead of waiting for people to die, why don't we just kill them? Yes, that's exactly what they did. They decided to kill them. So they kind of killed people in the same way each time. Basically, it involved alcohol. So they would invite people over, or a person over. They would get them very drunk to the point where they could not, they just, were in a stupor, basically. And then at that point, when they're in a stupor, a person's in a stupor, you can just knock them over. And then they would sit on their chest. And if you read the histories, it'll say that they were suffocated by sitting on the chest. But, you know, I'm very much a nitpicky on forensic terminology, and suffocation in forensics is different. Okay, then suffocation is, it's kind of the deprivation of oxygen containing air. Okay, so an example of suffocation would be someone who puts a bag around their head and maybe puts tape or ties it. This is a common way that I see. Every year I see a few suicides like this. Put a bag around the head, and basically what happens is you just normally respirate. So inside the bag, there's oxygen. You breathe it in, and each breath, you're consuming oxygen and you're exhaling carbon dioxide. So as time goes on, a few minutes go by, and you've exhausted the oxygen and you've expelled the CO2, and the carbon dioxide is CO2, and then you simply die. That is deprivation of oxygen. So that's an example of suffocation. And then another example is putting a pillow or a blanket or something over the mouth or the nose, and just limiting the amount of air that can come in. Now, keep in mind, we're not talking about crushing the chest there. We're really just breathing it in, and we're breathing air that doesn't contain oxygen. So, what Burke and Hare, is they restricted the physical means of breathing. Now, that's what we talked about in episode one, right? Mechanical asphyxia, and or some people call it traumatic asphyxia. And so they have these people who are already in a stupor from alcohol, and then they sit on the chest, and then that's it. They can't breathe. It physically restricts their breathing. And so, I always like to tie in. You'll notice as I do these episodes, I always like to make a tie in from the previous episode. So there'll be like a chain all the way through the seasons. Well, in episode one, we talked about the autopsy of George Floyd. And although the primary mechanism was probably compression of the neck, there was also reports of people, other police officers who were kneeling on the body, possibly restricting breathing due to compression of the thorax, or even the abdomen. And so this would have been kind of similar to what Burke and Hare were doing. Now, this, believe it or not, is actually a forensic term called burking, Burking, referring to sitting on someone's chest or putting a heavy weight on their body so that they can't breathe. And so, this whole thing was crazy. They killed 16 or 18 people in that time, and they would just sell the bodies, get them drunk, sit on their chest, not suffocate, but mechanically asphyxiate them, sell their bodies. Now, of course, this is kind of interesting that they thought to do this, right? Because, as I said in the first episode, you would not see the classic features of compressional asphyxia with that kind of weight. Usually, you see petechiae and things like that, burst blood vessels and congestion of the head and neck and things like that with very heavy weights. And the example I gave was a mechanic underneath a vehicle, and the jack breaks, and then the car falls on him. In the case of burking, you would be able to actually kill the person, and there would be no evidence that that person was murdered. They would just say, "Oh, we found this person drunk," or "We found this person deceased." And so then the person working at the medical school, the surgeon who was kind of the director of the anatomy, he kind of just didn't ask questions about it. He said, "Oh, okay, great, a body. Here's your money, and then we're going to use these for dissection." So, fortunately, today that's not the way it goes. Today, of course, people donate their body to science. That's what they always say. They donate their body to science. It's a very altruistic thing to do. There's no killing or grave robbing involved, and ultimately involves the most sacred right, I think, if you want to use that term, of the medical student, which is being able to have this body donated by the person in their own goodwill for us to dissect and learn. And it's kind of amazing. It's a little bit of a surreal experience. Now, anybody who knows me knows that I love etymology. And, so let's talk about the etymology of cadaver. Okay. This derives from a Latin word, cadere, which actually means to fall or to perish or to die. And so, obviously, death, we all fall, we all perish. And the cadaver is the term that is been accepted to use for just for anatomical dissection. Corpse is different. Corpse is, of course, any dead body, but it's, to me, it's the unfixed, the untreated body. Um, so technically, both in terms of anatomical dissection and doing an autopsy, technically both of them are autopsies in different ways. The goal of the cadaveric dissection is purely academic. It's purely to imbue our minds with anatomical knowledge and to learn in greatest detail every visible structure in the human body. Whereas the autopsy otherwise is just to look for the cause and manner of death And again, we'll get into cause and manner, and we'll go through all that stuff in future episodes. Um, but back to the story. I just wanted to put the historical element in. I don't always do that, but in this case, it's such an interesting story. I had to tell it. Now, back to my discomfort with being for a dead body free life until age 25. Of course, I never got to do that autopsy. And, I find myself starting medical school. I'm on the first day of medical school in the anatomy lecture. I mean, technically, I think it was the second day, but we were in anatomy lecture, and you knew that after that lecture, it was time to go to gross anatomy and dissect. And it was a little nerve wracking, honestly. There was a lot of nervous energy in the room, not just from me, but from other people. And then there was this rumor, and there's always rumors. When you're in medical school, there's always rumors, there's always a little bit of hazing. But there was rumors about someone every year faints during the gross dissection, the gross anatomy dissection. So that made everything worse. And even one of the senior anatomy professors was sort of laughing about it. Yes, there's this thing about people who, at least one person every year faints during the gross anatomy lab. And so we're looking around the room, and there's approximately 30 of us in my class. And I think if we were all thinking, well, who's it going to be? Which one of us is going down? And so, you can imagine the anxiety that was kind of rising in all of us. So we finished the anatomy lecture and changed into our dissection clothes. Um, you picture scrubs like surgeons wear, but really we were just wearing clothes that you would wear in gym class in high school. We weren't cool enough for scrubs yet. And so, it just had this kind of surreal moment of being, you're going to produce, you're going to be involved in this sacred rite of medicine. And so we're all herded like cattle outside the gross anatomy door. Door finally opens. We walk in, and immediately the sight is of these 8 like steel coffin looking structures. And they are shaped like coffins because they, contain a human body. And really what they are is like a special kind of stainless steel dissection table. And but it was just so surreal to be in this small room, very small room actually, with what contains 8 dead bodies. And so we all kind of herded around the tables randomly, 3 or 4 of us, and we just kind of waited for the professor to give us instructions to start. Fold open the table, and then there's the black body bag. The black body bag, which you can tell is distended by a human body. So a little unnerving because, this is what they call the first patient. The gross anatomy cadaver in medical school is what's considered the medical student's first patient. They build that to us a lot. Now, as an aside, I know a lot of medical schools aren't even doing gross anatomy dissection now. They're doing it as virtual. They're doing it on, iPads, and they're doing it on people who have had, full body cuts of their body, like an MRI almost, and they review the levels of that. I'm not going to issue my opinion on whether or not I think that's a good idea. I just know I'm grateful that I got to do this with an actual human body and not a computer. But so here we are standing around this, and everyone just kind of has their eyes bugged out, and you can just feel the nervous energy. And before we knew it, it was time to open the bag. Start to open the bag, zip it open, and then this arm, it just kind of, it doesn't flop out because you have to consider that these cadavers are very stiff, but the arm just kind of comes out and it's at an angle. It's like this thin, angular arm. It's very cold. There's this icy red liquid kind of pouring out of the bag, which wasn't blood. It was more, well, I guess it was kind of blood mixed with the formaldehyde. And it was just a very unusual experience because you don't see the head, you don't see the face, and there's just this arm. And then all of a sudden you realize this is real. We are in this now. There is no turning back. And so, just as kind of like the what leads to this moment with the cadaver, of course, I know many of you have probably read that book called Stiff by a lady named Mary Roach. That is a very good book about gross anatomy. And so, I'm not going to go through all of the elements of how these cadavers come to be, but in short, before they come to us, they are submerged in a formalin, or that's a formaldehyde solution. So that's formaldehyde and water together to make a dilute solution called formalin. And so what happens is that body, which in my case the body had already been embalmed. Some of them had been embalmed, some of them hadn't been embalmed, but either way, it's the same effect. So what happens is formalin, which contains the formaldehyde chemical, it actually makes the body easier to cut. And we use that same chemical in the pathology lab. So if we get a tissue from a body, let's say a little piece of liver, a little piece of breast tissue, we can put that in formalin or formaldehyde solution and it will firm it up. It actually makes it firm. And it does this because formalin cross links, so it kind of etches the proteins together in the body, and it attaches at the site of certain amino acids, namely lysine, but there are other amino acids. And what happens is when all these proteins start to link together, it preserves it. And so the cadaver itself becomes very stiff. It's not soft. Now the freshly dead corpses is soft, and then it becomes firm. It becomes firm because of rigor mortis. And believe me, we're going to talk on this podcast, not today, but in the future, we're going to talk about the changes that occur after death, the timing of them, the decomposition. But rigor mortis sets in a freshly dead corpse, and it's the same. It's the same idea. Proteins kind of link. They kind of cross link in the muscle tissue, and they become very firm. The difference, though, in a corpse, in a person who is dead and not embalmed or submerged in formalin, or whiskey for that matter, is that the rigor mortis actually goes away after a few days and the body becomes very floppy and soft again. And with a cadaver, they never become soft again. They're stiff forever or until we're done dissecting them. And so this man, we knew he had been embalmed because he had the incisions at his groin, the femoral area, where they actually insert into the femoral vessels. They insert the trocar, and they add the embalming fluid, and he had stitches there. So we knew he had been embalmed, and so we removed the bag, and there he is. We can see his face now, and his arms are stretched across his abdomen, and you could tell it was in a position that was consistent with his funeral position, kind of that head forward and the hands across the abdomen, kind of clasped together. It was really a surreal thing. He was quite thin. He was tall. You could tell he was very tall. His abdomen was sunken in. His cheeks were sunken in, and even at the sides of his head, sunken in. That's something we call temporal wasting. Temporal referring to the temples, the side of the head. So when temporal wasting sets in, we know that this is a sign of malnutrition, kind of like, or wasting, like we see in terminal diseases like cancer. And so I know you've all probably seen patients or maybe unfortunately loved ones who have had terminal wasting from a chronic disease or even old age. And if you get to your 90s or hundreds, you're going to have wasting of your fatty tissue as it is. But this man was as stiff as a board, and you know he was a gray tan color head to toe, and this was going to be the subject of my attention and the attention of everyone in the class for the next 9 months of medical school. And we dissect every single nerve fiber, every muscle, every blood vessel, and that was our goal. We knew that this was going to be our patient that we were going to learn from. Now, the good news is everybody got their body out and nobody had fainted. So we all looked around the room. It was still very serious. It was one of the only times during my first year of medical school that everyone was pretty darn serious. because otherwise, there was at least some joking around now and then once the ice was broken with the body, but that first day was very serious. And as we looked around, everybody had that same kind of gray tan corpse look to it. And they were thin, they were obese. Some were men, some were women, some were very old people, some were middle aged people. My particular cadaver was an 80-something-year-old man, and he was a white male, and he had they had a little card which would give his name, or not his name, but it would give his age and what he died from. And my cadaver actually had died from complications of what's called chronic myelogenous leukemia. Now, chronic myelogenous leukemia is not typically a disease that will kill someone, but at his old age, it probably had, advanced to an acute leukemia. And acute leukemias in older folks can rapidly kill people. And so he looked quite wasted away, and partly from age and partly from, his disease, his cancer of his blood. And so, but at this point, now this is what's interesting. I expected we would start cutting and we would get on with it. But in fact, no scalpels would be used on the first day. The ritual at my school, which was the Indiana University School of Medicine, is that we were instructed to wash the body with soap and water and then shave all the hair off. Now this is an odd experience, right? I mean, to have to wash somebody else's body and to shave somebody else's body, it's almost like a ritualistic, almost like a religious type ritual. But the idea was to gain comfort with the body, to have a tactile or physical touch of the body over a period of a couple of hours of washing away all of this debris that was in the body bag, because you have all these sloughed off skin cells, you have respiratory material or even material from inside the stomach, if it was in there coming out during the moving of the body. You had blood that had been, what blood was left over after the embalming process would have been clotted. And then what clotted blood kind of becomes grainy and crumbly. And so this was all over the body. We all together washed this body head to toe. We touched every square inch, every square centimeter. And it really did make you feel acclimated to the body. Now, the shaving I was not cool with. I don't know. I just felt a little weird trying to shave a body, but we did. We shaved the body, and between the washing and the shaving, it was completely, um, it was an experience that kind of bonded all the people at the table, but at the same time, we now became pretty comfortable with this particular cadaver and ready to dissect. And so this was kind of what I get when I talk about the substance of death. I mean, you could feel how firm his tissues were, and you could feel how cold he was. It wasn't just room temperature; he felt cold, and it was an undeniably odd sensation. The skin, with his arms flexed, we had to actually do what's called breaking down of the rigor. So we had to move his arms, really, the really stiff arms, move him down to his side. In the freshly dead, the skin is supple. The color can be very similar to that in life. And but in the cadaver, we were talking uniform gray tan color, no vibrant colors like you see in the corpse, the freshly dead, the reds and the blues and the yellows that you see, and all the other many colors you can see inside the human body. But this way that we dissect the cadaver is like I said, it is a kind of autopsy, but it's different. Now, when we talk about etymology of the word autopsy, it means to see for oneself, right? So aut means self, and op means to see. So to see for oneself. And as learners, that's what we were doing. We were looking inside to see the machinations of this human body and learning about every single thing that puts it together. So, a standard autopsy might take something like, if you think about a drug overdose or a car accident, it might take an hour, but an anatomical dissection of a cadaver takes months. We started in August and we didn't finish until the end of March. And the reason for that is because when we perform an autopsy, we're not studying every anatomical structure head to toe. We're studying the anatomy, but we're also looking specifically for diseases, pathologies of the body organs. We're not going to study every nerve in the neck or every single structure in the brain. So, in a cadaver dissection in medical school, you might spend 2 weeks on the nerves and muscles of the arms. Whereas in an autopsy, you do not need to dissect the arm at all. You have a guy who comes in, maybe he collapsed at work. You don't need to dissect the arm. You know that's probably going to be a cardiac or a cardiopulmonary case, possibly a brain related case. Now, you do have to dissect an autopsy limbs and other various structures if you're looking for something that had been injured. For instance, a gunshot wound to the arm, I will dissect the arm and I will see what it broke or what it injured. But decidedly different experience, a much more involved experience, head to toe with the cadaver dissection. Now, all this being said, we did the first day, we came back the second time, and it was time for the first cut. And the first cut, that is where you really understand the substance of death of the cadaver. Uh, I felt that I needed to cut this body to overcome my apprehension and fears. I wanted to be the first one in my group to grab the scalpel and go. And, there we were kind of standing there. There was a tray, a surgical tray of scalpels. And, it's just, the scalpel looked like it had been used in the 1800s. It was like an old wooden scalpel with a blade attached to it. And the body itself, having been washed and shaved, we had wrapped gauze around all the areas we weren't dissecting. So the limbs and the head were wrapped in gauze. It was a very impersonal type procedure. But I just felt like this was like ripping a band aid off. You rip it off quickly and you get it over with versus pulling it slowly and suffering with every single bit of pain. I grabbed the scalpel and my knife hovered above the skin of the back, and I just kind of waited for the professor to say go. And my knife is sitting there parallel. And finally, she said go, and I dropped the blade, plunged it right into the skin without hesitation. But oddly, it did not make a sound. It was silent. And I pulled the scalpel in my opening incision along the midline of the back because we were starting to dissect the midline of the back, to look at the muscles of the back and of the back of the neck was where we started in my dissection at my medical school. And, the fact that it didn't make any sound at all, there was no recoil of the skin like you see with a fresh corpse. It was just gray and leathery. And as I pulled the knife through, it was left with just a sharp edge slit where the scalpel had passed through. And like I said, the silence of that cut was maybe unexpected. The material of the skin, the epidermis and the dermis and the subcutaneous fat, it had a consistency almost like a very sharp knife cutting through a soft cheese. Just no sound at all, and it just kind of split open. It was uh, a really surreal experience, and I looked around, and once again, no one had fainted. So we were just kind of hoaxed a little bit with another urban legend of medical school lore. And so at that point, things got going. We were really hitting the ground running. We each took turns cutting this body, getting comfortable with it, and, proceeded over months. Usually we would do 1 to 2 people dissecting at one time, while the other 2 people stood there with a lab manual and went through kind of guiding us, with various um, uh, help on, this nerve is next to this blood vessel and be careful not to cut it and sort of coaching us. And so we would switch back and forth. But overall, the thing is no small task. I mean, we're looking through every organ, every single muscle, every blood vessel and its associated branches. every nerve and its associated branches. And everything in the cadaver appears to be a shade of gray tan. And, it's very boring looking because you don't get to see those colors. But, for the morbidly curious, it's almost like an incredible Easter egg hunt because you're looking for a certain nerve or a certain a blood vessel. And when you find you have that eureka moment. And, I think with understanding the substance of death with the cadaver is that firmness, that uniformity of color, and the dissection process itself so different because with the cadaver we take it completely apart, and I mean we saw the pelvis in half, we disarticulated the limbs, we took off the top of the skull and removed the brain to send for neuroanatomy, and then at some point we finally sawed the head completely in half. And this is far greater than what we do at autopsy. At autopsy, we do, we do get inside the head, we do get inside the body cavities, but we don't cut the body in such a way that it distorts the body. We try not to distort the body because, remember, we're seeing it as forensic pathologists and autopsy pathologists. We're seeing the body before it goes for a funeral. And a lot of people, we're in the Western world here. Almost everybody has a funeral. And so we want to do that procedure of autopsy and then make it look like the body has never been cut. And there are ways to do that. And again, I'm going to talk about the autopsy procedure itself, mostly in the throughout. But in the next podcast, we're going to talk about the corpse dissection or the autopsy. But in this case, we weren't just making the limited amount of cuts that we make with autopsy. We were taking the body apart, and it assaults the senses, all of the senses, because you have to use saws, electric saws, and there's lots of dust, bone dust that smells like singed hair. There's always that smell of cleaning chemicals as we try to sterilize everything, and that ever-present smell of formaldehyde. And so this procedure is it certainly was a humbling procedure for me to take 9 months and take a human body from an intact human male and reduce him literally to two 5-gallon buckets of tissue. And that is exactly what happened. You go through and you dissect out every single little piece, and every piece you remove, you put it into a 5-gallon bucket, and that is saved. Even the rinsings from the table will go into those buckets because eventually this material will be cremated and or buried. And so you can't just treat it like it's trash. You can't just cut a piece of tissue out and throw it in the garbage and move on. We try to be as respectful as we can when we do anatomical dissection, not only with the cadaver, but with the autopsy. We have to, as I said earlier, if we really are just meat and bones, then what value do we have? But we, in a sense, as I said, we were animated at one point, and we have to carry that from the point of the last breath to the grave. And so we try to be as respectful as we can. And so with that, I think I've spoken enough on this particular issue with the cadaver. As always, most people know how to reach me at Instagram, Anatomy in the Dead. And also I have a Knife After Death page on Facebook. And eventually we'll be getting a website and email address for you to direct your questions to. Because what I would like to do is, if there's any major misconceptions or things that people think I left out or got wrong, I'd like to address those at the beginning of each podcast as we go along, as we go forward. Again, I'm still in kind of a testing phase where we're going to see what works and what doesn't work. But I hope you enjoyed this part 1 of Corpses and Cadavers, where we talked about the cadaveric dissection. next time when we speak, when you listen to me speak, it'll be about my first autopsy, my very first autopsy, which I did when I was a resident, a first year resident in pathology. And that is a completely different sensation experience, a completely different concept of what I call the substance of death. So, with that said, I hope you enjoyed this, and please tell your friends and tell your family about this podcast, and come back and listen to episode 3, which will be part 2 of Corpses and Cadavers. Thank you.